Hey guys, so I wanted to show you something that I do to my tomatoes at the very beginning of the season and also about mid-season. Now these tomato plants are barely a month old and they've just exploded with growth. These two beds, I don't know if you can see this one, but they have just done extremely well. They're producing tomatoes very quickly and they're just loaded with flowers ready to produce a second set. But this is a system, I call it a system, but it's actually a method where you add specific ingredients to the tomato plant, but in a very specific way, a specific method that old-time farmers use. So let's head into the greenhouse and I'll show you exactly how to do this. And even if you only have one tomato plant, it'll be probably more than you can consume in the entire season. So guys, this is a two-part video, but it's going to be all in this one video, but I'm showing this in two parts. The first part is going to be what we're putting in with this mix. The second part is going to be actually demonstrating how you do this. Now, as I said, I did this early in the season when the tomato plants were just barely over a foot tall, and now I'm doing it again just to boost the production and produce more and more tomatoes. So the tomatoes are going to be extremely happy and they're going to work extremely well at producing more tomatoes than you can eat. So let's get started on putting all this together. All this is very common stuff and you can find it in any garden center, and I'll even put links in the description so you can have it shipped right to you. There's only one or two items that you'll need to pick up because of weight issues, and shipping costs would probably be too prohibitive. So let's get started on showing the mix we're going to put into this 2-gallon bucket. So the first ingredient we're adding to our bucket is fully decomposed compost. If you make your own compost, that's great. If you don't have a homemade composter, and I'll show you a video right here of how to make your own compost, but if you don't have compost, you can use worm castings. I actually ordered these from Amazon. It's a kind of a small bag, but we only need 2 to 3 cups in this recipe. So again, if you don't have access to some really high quality compost, you can order worm castings. Now this is going to improve the soil texture, moisture retention. Is going to add a lot of microbial life to this method we're using. And so composting or worm castings is going to be really important as our first ingredient. Now next we're going to be adding 2 cups of well-aged manure, and I always recommend black cow. If you have access to fresh manure, whether it's chicken, horse, cow, you're going to want to make sure you let it age for about 4 months because it will burn the plants. And this also adds a lot of microbial life. Again, this is really something that makes a huge difference in my garden. I've talked about it many times. This is something that's really heavy per bag, so it's not something you're going to be able to have shipped over the internet because it would be too cost prohibitive to do that. So make sure you pick this up at a hardware store. It's sold just about everywhere. So again, 2 cups at the beginning of the season. Now usually what I do when I'm remixing this for a larger tomato plant, I'll double just the black cow to 4 cups to make sure that we have plenty of manure, because we're really feeding a much larger plant than we did at the beginning of the season. Now the next thing I think is one of the most important things, and that is bone meal. It is very high in phosphorus, our NPK numbers, and P is our phosphorus, and that's what will help more flowers to form and more roots to form. So we're going to take 2 tablespoons of bone meal, and it's lower in excuse me, it's lower in nitrogen. If I can get this out there, we're almost out of bone meal, so that tells you how much I use this. I use this all over the garden on not only vegetables but also ornamentals. But we take 2 tablespoons of this, whether we're doing this at the beginning of the season or an established plant that's growing well. But it really makes a huge difference on flower production, which ultimately becomes your tomato. So remember, 2 tablespoons at the beginning of the season, and once the plant has become established and might be 2 to 3 feet tall, you want to speed up the production of those flowers and ultimately, like I said, tomatoes. Now the next ingredient is blood meal, and blood meal is high in nitrogen, so we're not wanting a lot of leaf growth once the plant becomes established. So we're going to start off at the beginning stage of the plant. We're going to put in 2 tablespoons when the plant is first planted. But again, like I said, we're going mid-season now, or early into our June here, so we're only going to put 1 in. So remember, at the beginning of the season, do 2 tablespoons and then drop it back to 1 when we go back mid-season to add the second dose of this method. Now next is our Epsom salt, and we're going to do this the same level or the same amount at the beginning of the growth cycle and then midway. So we're only going to do 1 tablespoon. We don't want to overdo it with Epsom salt, and technically it's not salt, it's more magnesium. So we're going to do 1 at our mid-season where we're at now. So just remember, we don't want to overdo it with Epsom salt because it can have a little bit of buildup effect, but this can help with blossom end rot and some other issues. So if you have low magnesium soils, it can make a huge difference by adding this. So if you're having a problem with the underside of your tomatoes look like they're rotting and the top side of your tomatoes look like they're perfectly fine, you have blossom end rot. So this right here can help. Also, if you're having it and you have a very poor calcium soil, it could be a calcium deficiency. So adding extra eggshells, take a lot of eggshells, put them in a blender, make them into a fine powder, and then do 2 tablespoons. If this doesn't help with blossom end rot, it could be a calcium deficiency in your soil. Now, before I move forward with the second set of ingredients, because we went through 5 so far, including the eggshell powder, it seems like this is a lot of stuff to buy, but really it's not, because this stuff will last from season to season to season. So some of these things I've had in the greenhouse for 2, 3, 4 years, and it doesn't go bad. I keep it inside of a shelf area. It's perfectly fine to do this. Now the next item is going to be fish fertilizer, which basically is just ground up fish. And I can tell you, if you're very averse to strong odors, the fish fertilizer absolutely does have a strong odor if you do a foliar feeding. You will smell it in your garden for the rest of the day and possibly the next day. So with this formula, we're only adding about 1 shot glass to our mix. Now it will be a little bit of a smell right next to the tomato plants, but it won't be anything like I've done in the past where I did just an overspray and it was a tremendous smell throughout the garden for about 48 hours. So fish fertilizer has a lot of trace minerals in it, and it's really one of those things that you need to have a bottle of this in your greenhouse. Again, I'll link some down below if you don't have access to this in your area. Now this next ingredient here, I can make all I want for free. I just ordered this off the internet to show you or to demonstrate. You can get this online because a lot of people do not have access to wood ash. They don't have a burn pit. They don't have a lot of limbs like I do. I have 2 acres of trees, so I'm always burning limbs. I don't want to send them off to the garbage dump, so I want to recycle them in some way. So wood ash is incredibly important. It will increase the sweetness. Potash or potassium is what this is basically. So when you burn them, save the ashes. Remember, don't make potash, if you are making it, don't make it out of any type of treated lumber. You want just nothing but limbs. And sometimes the smaller, tinier limbs produce a higher quality because it contains, again, a lot of trace elements and a lot of potassium. So smaller limbs actually work better than large tree limbs. Now let me take a step back. I didn't mention how much I'm adding here, but this is half a cup of our potash or potassium or just burnt limbs. So that's one thing you want to remember. Half a cup. We don't want to overdo it because it can compete with other nutrients and draw other nutrients out. So just do a half a cup per container here, so don't overdo it there. And you can upsize it if you're doing a 5-gallon bucket. This is basically going to be about 1 gallon of finished product we're making. Now next we're using kelp meal or liquid seaweed, and we're using about 2 tablespoons, and this will help with drought resistant, heat, disease, and many other features. So this is really something that farmers throughout the world use seaweed to help boost their plants. So liquid seaweed is what I recommend. I'll put a link to that as well. So it works really great in this small little formula for each tomato plant. So next is this fungi, which is hard for me to pronounce, but mycorrhizal fungi. You can get it in a liquid or in a powder. And this really kind of forms a symbiotic relationship between the roots and the nutrients and helps it just really take them all in. So I would say out of everything in the list that we are having today, this is probably the most important because it makes the nutrients so much more available to our tomato plant. Now, whether you're using the powdered form or the liquid form, I usually put in about 1 full tablespoon into our bucket mix. Now, the next 3 items are optional, but they can be important depending on what type of soil you have and your overall goals. The first is biochar, and I've got a video where I'll show you exactly how to make that, but it can absorb nutrients like a sponge and help them to stay in the soil. Once you make it yourself, you'll find that biochar can be one of the most important things you can do to your garden. A lot of people talk about it, but very few people actually do it. So that video will help you to understand exactly what it is, and it's been used for literally thousands of years to improve poor soils and help gardens perform better. Now, the second of the 3 items we're adding that are optional is molasses, and organic molasses is your best bet there. That will help the microbial life, it will feed it and help it to reproduce, the beneficial microbial life. So roughly about 1 to 2 tablespoons in your bucket here like I said earlier, at the beginning of the season and middle way through the season, molasses will help you. Now the third of the three optionals is humic acid, and you can get it as a liquid or a granular, and that's another thing that's going to help the nutrients be absorbed better, and it works well with compost or worm casting, so they kind of work together there to make it even better. Generally on the humic acid, if I do add it, and it's not every time, but I usually do about 2 tablespoons per container size of this. Now this is not a full container, as I said, this is just the ingredients we've shown, we're mixing it all together. So roughly 2 tablespoons of that in its granular form. Now 3 final tips before we head out to the garden, and I'll show you exactly how this works around your tomato plant, is you want to make sure that your pH is right for your tomatoes. If your pH is way off, then you can do all of this and you'll still have really poor results. But you want to make sure it's between 6.2 and 6.8. Buying one of these really inexpensive pH testers really makes a difference. It also tests the moisture content as well. So I would always recommend having a pH tester in the garden. You can go as far as sending it off to a lab, but then you're talking about a delay in timing and things like that. So just having a simple pH tester, you're going to get pretty close results. But that's one of the most important things, is to make sure your soil is at the right pH. Now, adjusting your pH can be an entire video in itself, but just very simply put, lime can raise your pH and sulfur can lower your pH. So again, that's a whole nother video, but that's the way you can do it, is those 2 ingredients right there. Now tomatoes hate growing in soggy soil, so there's a few things you can do there, and one of them I've actually done in my vegetable garden. But we have a very high water table here. I think I'm 19 feet below the surface. We actually have water, so my well, which is 300 feet deep, is really quite a bit of overkill, but it'll never run dry. But a couple of things you can do, or actually 3 things you can do. One, if you're growing in direct ground, you can add a lot of sand to your soil. That will help it drain, because tomatoes hate standing in soggy soil. Number 2 is adding perlite to it, or as I do in my garden, do your gardening in raised vegetable beds, and that way you have sure that you're not letting your tomatoes grow in soggy soil. Now the last tip I'm going to give you before we head out to the vegetable garden, I'll show you how this all comes together, is to make sure that you are adding a 1.5 to 2.5 inch layer of some type of cover on your ground, because it will dry out, it will bake, it will not work as well whether you're using straw or pine bark. Now I personally like this soil conditioner I found at Lowe's here in America, because it is finely ground pine bark. Yes, it does change the pH of the soil just ever so slightly, but not a lot. So if you're going to make sure that you want to have lots of tomatoes, and happy tomatoes at that, make sure you do something like this to keep the soil from completely drying out in the summer sun. Now we have added some liquids to this, so we want to make sure that we break everything up and mix it as well as possible. So just going in there by hand and just swirling it around, and make sure we mix this. Now we're only doing a mixture for 1 plant, and what I would say is if you're going to do multiple tomatoes, because this is my all-day project today, is to maybe mix it in something like a 20-gallon container. It makes it a lot easier. You just 20x everything on the recipe, and like I said, this is only once when you plant your tomatoes and then halfway through the season. So just make sure it's well mixed before you go to the next step. Now this entire process is very simple, and anybody who's into farming or knows anything about it, this is called hilling, H-I-L-L-I-N-G, not H-E-E-L or not H-E-A-L. It's hilling. You're creating something that looks like a small ant mound at the base of the plant. A couple of very important tips I'll give you as we do this, but just make sure that everything is mixed quite well so it just looks like soil, but we know that it's got a lot more than just soil mixed into this little mound mixture we're making. Now some general rules for doing this is you want to wait till the plant is about 12 to 18 inches tall at the beginning of the season, and it has a strong central stem. So these have tripled from the first. We've had a lot of settlement. I've added some of this top dressing to keep some of the moisture in the soil. So a lot of settling, and you don't see much of the old mound because it was right close to ground level before I added all this. So just remember that you want to wait till it's at least 12 inches tall before we do this process. Now if you're transplanting the tomato from another container and you haven't been growing in an open ground, you want to make sure that you do this early morning or late afternoon to avoid any type of transplant shock. Now, if you are transplanting a larger plant from another container, you want to add this to the surrounding soil about 8 to 12 inches in a circular pattern where you're going to be planting it and mix it into the soil. So maybe actually creating a double dose before we create our mound. You'll be in the soil and you'll also be creating this really nutritious mound around the base of each small 12-inch tall plant. Now, when I first did this, the tomato plants were only about 12 or 13 inches tall, so the mounds were quite a bit higher on the plant. But again, this time we're creating a mound for a much more mature plant, so we're going to use this entire amount. And if we actually cover limbs, that's fine, especially on the smaller size plants. So if there's smaller limbs, you can go halfway up and cover those limbs, and that will turn into roots themselves. So there can be small nodules on these limbs which turn into roots in themselves. Now, a lot of people say that the hairs become roots. I've actually read where that the little white nodules sometimes you'll see on the plant, that's actually what becomes the root. So maybe it's the hairs, maybe it's the nodules. There's a little bit of debate there. So just remember, you're creating this very nutritious mound. You're going to pack it around it. Now, like I said, this is more of a mid-season now, but when we did this earlier, the tomato plant looked like it was half buried in this mound. So just remember, lightly pack it, but don't highly compress it. Just give it a light touching, and if you buried some limbs and leaves, no problem. Don't remove them, just leave them there, and that will really boost your tomatoes, your overall growth, and future production of tomato yield. Now, I spoke earlier about adding this mulch to it, and I really think it's a lot more important than people realize, because this can stop a lot of soil-borne diseases. So just remember, by doing that, you're stopping the possible, during a rain event, splashing back up on the leaves of anything that might start a disease in your tomatoes. So mulching is critical, not just for moisture retention, but also disease prevention. So just remember that whatever you're using, and I prefer, like I said, this very fine pine bark. As you can see, it's been ground very small. Whether you're using pine needles or hay or straw, whatever you're using, make sure you have an extra thick barrier around the base of the plant to prevent any diseases from cropping up later on. Now, once you've done this to all your tomato plants at their early stages, and also when you do this during the mid-growing season, you want to make sure you get a heavy soaking water, maybe 1 to 2 gallons per plant right after that, and then you should be good for quite a while. You don't have to water this every day, but you want to allow it to dry out just a little bit before you go into another heavy watering to get your tomatoes growing as quickly as possible and producing as many tomatoes as possible, and the sweetest and largest size based upon the ingredients we've added to our bucket. Now, as you can see, I love growing tomatoes, and this is not even the entire tomato set I'm growing. This is only a part, and I actually grow them in pots and other areas of the garden as well. But the ongoing process of making sure your tomatoes are producing as much as possible, as fast as possible, is to continue by adding about, I would say, 1.5 to 2 cups of your composted manure each month, and also at the same time mix it in with about 2 tablespoons of bone meal, and that will really boost flower production and increase the root growth as we go through the season. Just remember to add those 2 items about once a month to maximize each tomato plant's potential. Now, as far as foliar feeding, it's a good idea to do that about every 10 to 14 days with a mixture of your liquid seaweed and bone meal, about 1 gallon to 1 tablespoon of each of those. So 1 gallon of liquid seaweed and 1 tablespoon of the bone meal. Mix it in a gallon of water and just go throughout your garden with your sprayer. Make sure if I could get this out, make sure that it's well mixed, because you can clog your sprayer very easily. And I always prefer going through the garden with my backpack sprayer, because I can do everything at once a lot easier with a battery powered backpack and not have to do the manual spraying. So let me head back into the greenhouse and we'll finish up. So guys, this may seem like a lot of extra work, but it just really makes a huge difference in the health and happiness of your tomatoes, and you'll know that it's really making them happy because the amount of produce they're going to produce is going to be beyond your imagination. So guys, I really appreciate you watching. If you have a question about this video or any previous video, I hope you'll become a public subscriber first, because I always put any public subscriber questions or comments to the front of the line so I can answer those the fastest. I get about anywhere from 100 to 300 questions and comments a day, and so it's just nearly impossible for me to go through each one and answer them properly. So I always give priority to anybody who's already a subscriber. So guys, I really appreciate it, and have a great day.